Sex or history? It will be clear by this point that the centrality of sexual questions in this study is important to its methodological ambitions as well. I am going to be recurring to the subject of sex as an especially charged leverage point, or a point for the exchange of meanings between gender and class, and in many societies, race. The sets of categories by which we ordinarily try to describe the divisions of human labor. And methodologically, I want to situate these readings as a contribution to a dialectic within feminist theory between more or less historicizing views of the oppression of women. In a rough way, we can label the extremes on this theoretical spectrum Marxist feminism for the most historicizing analysis, radical feminism for the least. Of course, radical feminism is so called not because it occupies the farthest left space on a conventional political map, but because it takes gender itself, gender alone, to be the most radical division of human experience, and a relatively unchanging one. For the purposes of the present argument, in addition, and for reasons that I will explain more fully later, I am going to be assimilating French feminism, deconstructive and or Lacanian-oriented feminism, to the radical feminist end of this spectrum. French and radical feminism differ on very many, very important issues, such as how much respect they give to the brute fact that everyone gets categorized as either female or male. But they are alike in seeing all human culture, language, and life as structured in the first place, structured radically, trans-historically, and essentially similarly, however coarsely or finely, by a drama of gender difference. Chapter 1 discusses more fully the particular terms by which this structuralist motive will be represented in the present study. French feminist and radical feminist prose tend to share the same vatic and perhaps imperialistic uses of the present tense. In a sense, the polemical energy behind my arguments will be a desire, through the rhetorically volatile subject of sex, to recruit the representational finesse of deconstructive feminism in the service of a more historically discriminate mode of analysis. The choice of sexuality as a thematic emphasis of this study makes salient and problematical a division of thematic emphasis between Marxist feminist and radical feminist theory as they are now practiced. Specifically, Marxist feminism, the study of the deep interconnections between, on the one hand, historical and economic change, and on the other, the vicissitudes of gender division, has typically proceeded in the absence of a theory of sexuality and without much interest in the meaning or experience of sexuality. Or more accurately, it has held implicitly to a view of female sexuality as something that is essentially of a piece with reproduction, and hence appropriately studied with the tools of demography, or else essentially of a piece with the simple prescriptive hegemonic ideology, and hence appropriately studied through intellectual or legal history. Where important advances have been made by Marxist feminist-oriented research into sexuality, it has been in areas that were already explicitly distinguished as deviant by the society's legal discourse. Signally, homosexuality for men and prostitution for women. Marxist feminism has been of little help in unpacking the historical meanings of women's experiences of heterosexuality, or even until it becomes legally and medically visible in this century, of lesbianism. Radical feminism, on the other hand, in the many different forms I am classing under that head, has been relatively successful in placing sexuality in a prominent and interrogative position, one that allows scope for the decentered and the contradictory. Kathleen Berry's Female Sexual Slavery Susan Griffin's Pornography in Silence, Gilbert and Gubar's The Mad Woman in the Attic, Jane Gallop's The Daughter Seduction, and Andrea Dworkin's Pornography, Men Possessing Women, make up an exceedingly heterogeneous group of texts in many respects. In style, in agency, in explicit feminist identification, in French or American affiliation, in brow elevation level. They have in common, however, a view that sexuality is centrally problematical in the formulation of women's experience, and in more or less sophisticated formulations. The subject, as well as the ultimate object of female heterosexuality within what is called patriarchal culture, are seen as male. Whether in literal interpersonal terms or in internalized psychological and linguistic terms, this approach privileges sexuality and often sees it within the context of the structure that Lévi-Strauss analyzes as the male traffic in women. This family of approaches has, however, shared with other forms of structuralism a difficulty in dealing with the diachronic. It is the essence of structures viewed as such to reproduce themselves, and historical change from this point of view appears as something outside of structure and threatening. Or worse, not threatening to it, rather than in a formative and dialectical relation with it. History tends thus to be either invisible or viewed in an impoverishingly glaring and contrastive light. Implicitly or explicitly, radical feminism tends to deny that the meaning of gender or sexuality has ever significantly changed. And more damagingly, it can make future change appear impossible or necessarily apocalyptic, even though desirable. Alternatively, it can radically oversimplify the prerequisites for significant change. In addition, history, even in the residual synchronic form of class or racial difference and conflict, becomes invisible, or excessively coarsened and dichotomized in the universalizing structuralist view. As feminist readers, then, we seem poised for the moment between reading sex and reading history, at a choice that appears, though it must be wrongly, to be between the synchronic and the diachronic. We know that it must be wrongly viewed in this way, not only because, in the abstract, the synchronic and the diachronic must ultimately be considered in relation to one another, but because specifically in the disciplines we are considering, they are so mutually inscribed. The narrative of Marx's history is so graphic, and the schematics of structuralist sexuality so narrative. I will be trying in this study to activate and use some of the potential congruences of the two approaches. Part of the underpinning of this attempt will be a continuing meditation on ways in which the category ideology can be used as part of an analysis of sexuality. The two categories seem comparable in several important ways. Each mediates between the material and the representational, for instance. Ideology, like sexuality as we have discussed it, both epitomizes and itself influences broader social relations of power. And each, I shall be arguing, mediates similarly between diachronic narrative structures of social experience and synchronic graphic ones. If common sense suggests that we can roughly group historicizing Marxist feminism with the diachronic and the narrative, and radical structuralist, deconstructive, and French feminisms with the synchronic and the graphic, then the methodological promise of these two mediating categories will be understandable. In the German ideology, Marx suggests that the function of ideology is to conceal contradictions in the status quo by, for instance, recasting them into a diachronic narrative of origins. Corresponding to that function, one important structure of ideology is an idealizing appeal to the outdated values of an earlier system, in defense of a later system that in practice undermines the material basis of those values. For instance, Juliet Mitchell analyzes the importance of the family in ideologically justifying the shift to capitalism in these terms. Quote, "The peasant masses of feudal society had individual private property. Their ideal was simply more of it. Capitalist society seemed to offer more because it stressed the idea of individual private property in a new context, or in a context of new ideas. Thus, it offered individualism, an old value, plus the apparently new means for its greater realization, freedom and equality, values that are conspicuously absent from feudalism. However, the only place where this ideal could be given an apparently concrete base was in the maintenance of an old institution, the family. Thus, the family changed from being the economic basis of individual private property under feudalism to being the focal point of the idea of individual private property under a system that banished such an economic form from its central mode of production, capitalism. The working class work socially in production for the private property of a few capitalists in the hope of individual private property for themselves and their families." The phrase, "a man's home is his castle," offers a nicely condensed example of ideological construction in this sense. It reaches back to an emptied-out image of mastery and integration under feudalism in order to propel the male wage worker forward to further feats of alienated labor, in the service of a now atomized and embattled, but all the more intensively idealized home. The man who has this home is a different person from the lord who has a castle, and the forms of property implied in the two possessives, his mortgaged home, his inherited castle, are not only different, but, as Mitchell points out, mutually contradictory. The contradiction is assuaged and filled in by transferring the lord's political and economic control over the environs of his castle to an image of the father's personal control over the inmates of his house. The ideological formulation thus permits a crisscrossing of agency, temporality, and space. It is important that ideology, in this sense, even when its form is flatly declarative, a man's home in his castle, is always at least implicitly narrative, and that in order for the reweaving of ideology to be truly invisible, the narrative is necessarily chiasmic in structure. That is, that the subject of the beginning of the narrative is different from the subject at the end, and that the two subjects cross each other in a rhetorical figure that conceals their discontinuity. It is also important that the sutures of contradiction in these ideological narratives become most visible under the dissembling eye of an alternative narrative, ideological as that narrative may itself be. In addition, the diachronic opening out of contradictions within the status quo, even when the project of that diachronic recasting is to conceal those very contradictions, can have just the opposite effect of making them newly visible, offering a new leverage for critique. For these reasons, distinguishing between the construction and the critique of ideological narrative is not always even a theoretical possibility, even with relatively flat texts. With the fat, rich texts we are taking for examples in this project, no such attempt will be made. Sexuality, like ideology, depends on the mutual redefinition and occlusion of synchronic and diachronic formulations. The developmental fact that, as Freud among others has shown, even the naming of sexuality as such is always retroactive in relation to most of the sensations and emotions that constitute it, is historically important. What counts as the sexual is, as we shall see, variable and itself political. The exact contingent space of indeterminacy, the place of shifting over time, of the mutual boundaries between the political and the sexual is, in fact, the most fertile space of ideological formation. This is true because ideological formation, like sexuality, depends on retroactive change in the naming or labeling of the subject. The two sides, the political and the erotic, necessarily obscure and misrepresent each other, but in ways that offer important and shifting affordances to all parties in historical gender and class struggle.